Hi again. We're in F.F. Bruce's book, The Real Jesus, in his chapter entitled The Risen Lord. What is meant by resurrection? This is part 2 of his discussion. The apostolic proclamation was, Jesus is alive, but if he was alive, it followed that he could not be in the tomb. It's easy for us today to talk of a spiritual resurrection and emphasize that this is what is really important. What does it matter if John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave, so long as his soul goes marching on? But that is not what the followers of Jesus meant when they spoke of his resurrection in the 1st century A.D., and that is not what their hearers understood them to mean. By resurrection, they meant the resurrection of the body. If they had meant only that the spirit and power of Jesus lived on, resurrection is not the word that they would have used. They might have spoken rather of a sort of immortality, or said that, though dead, he still empowered others. Moreover, even if they had used this word to mean that Jesus' spirit and power lived on, their proclamation would have been pointless if his body was still in the tomb, or in some other place to which it had been moved. The authorities would simply have organized visits to the place to demonstrate that he had not risen from the dead, in the only sense which those words carried for most Jews at that time. Christianity would never have got off the ground. Indeed, if Jesus had not risen from the dead, we should probably never have heard of him. Not more than 20 years after Jesus' death, Paul of Tarsus visited Corinth and preached the gospel there. He based his message on 3 historical facts, as he believed them to be, facts which he held in common with men who had been around at the time in question. They were these: Christ died, Christ was buried, Christ was raised on the 3rd day. This mention of the 3rd day was constant in the early apostolic preaching and is enshrined in the church's creeds. It implies inclusive reckoning in which the 3 days are Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. The fact that Christ was buried receives separate mention, not only to emphasize that he was really dead and buried as we say, to emphasize the reality and finality of the death, but also to indicate that the resurrection was a reversal not only of the death, but also of the burial. In other words, to indicate that Jesus left the tomb untenanted. Paul, for his part, had never seen the empty tomb. He became a Christian when he met the living Christ on the Damascus Road. But some of those who met the living Christ at an earlier date, on the 3rd day from his crucifixion, also saw the empty tomb. One of these has left a circumstantial record of what he saw. That is the record preserved in John 20, verses 1 to 10. The historical tradition which forms the basis of the 4th gospel bears the signs of first-hand testimony, and that is true of this part of John's resurrection narrative. Writing as a dramatic critic, the late Dorothy L. Sayers pointed out that the 4th gospel is the only one that claims to be the direct report of an eyewitness. And she added, and to any one accustomed to the imaginative handling of documents, the internal evidence bears out this claim. There is certainly something of an eyewitness quality about John's description of the empty tomb, and especially of the arrangement of the grave clothes which had been left behind, an arrangement which suddenly made the beloved disciple realize what had happened. He saw and believed. John 20, verse 8. This subhead is the early preaching. In the earliest Christian writings that have been preserved for us, the resurrection of Jesus is presupposed and affirmed. If, as I am disposed to believe, the earliest Christian document surviving is Paul's letter to the Galatians, written around AD 48, then it opens with Paul's introduction of himself as an apostle through Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised him from the dead. If, as most New Testament students think, the earliest Christian document is the first letter to the Thessalonians sent by Paul and 2 of his colleagues to the church of Thessalonica in AD 50, the recipients of that letter are reminded at an early stage how they turned to God from idols, to serve a living and true God, and to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead. That's 1 Thessalonians 1, verses 9 and 10. It is plain from such references that what is there set down in black and white was earlier proclaimed by word of mouth. Both these documents come from Paul, whether in association with others or not. But the resurrection message did not originate with Paul. Paul accepted it for himself about AD 33, when the risen Lord appeared to him on the Damascus road and conscripted him into his service. But Paul knew that others were proclaiming it before that event. However, it is to Paul that we owe the earliest summary of Jesus' resurrection appearances. He gives it in 1 Corinthians 15, 1-8. That letter, as we have seen in another connection, was written in AD 55. But in this passage, Paul reminds the Christians in Corinth of something that he had told them when he first preached the gospel in their city 5 years previously. In addition, what he told them then was something that he himself had been told several years before, that quite early in his Christian career. According to Paul's own account, when he first came to Corinth, he decided, in preaching to those who lived there, to know nothing among them except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. That's 1 Corinthians 2, verse 2. This was because he knew that the proclamation of a crucified Savior would make no concessions to those standards of secular wisdom by which the Greeks of Corinth and elsewhere set so much store. Rather, it made nonsense of them. But it is plain from the whole tenor of Paul's writings that for him the proclamation of Christ crucified involved the proclamation of Christ risen from the dead. Paul knew before his conversion that Jesus had been crucified. That had simply convinced him that Jesus could not be the Messiah of Israel. It was the revelation of the crucified Jesus risen from the dead that turned Paul around in his tracks and made a Christian of him. The crucifixion and the resurrection are necessary to each other. There can be no gospel without both, for neither is meaningful without the other. Next time, F.F. Bruce gets into the resurrection appearances. We'll put a link into Paul's preaching in Athens. No name, no kingdom, but a judgment day. That was Paul's bottom line when he got to Athens. And the tetragrammaton and even the word kingdom were not in the message as we have a copy of it in Acts chapter 17. But judgment day definitely was. So Paul's message to the Greeks involved the resurrection too, because by the time he gets to judgment day, and it says that that day of judgment will be conducted by a man who God has appointed, and he furnished a guarantee to all men that they will be there on judgment day, in that he raised that man, the judge, from the dead. When he gets to that point in the Athens sermon, of course, things happen. So next time, the resurrection appearances.